Have you ever been at your weakest moment and discovered exactly who someone really was? Not during a disagreement, not during an argument, but when you were vulnerable, scared, and completely unable to defend yourself. Because that's exactly what happened to me. And it changed my relationship with my father forever. My name is Henry Carter. I'm 68 years old, and for most of my life I spent far too much time trying to earn my father's approval. Some people grow up with supportive parents. Parents who encourage them. Parents who celebrate their victories. Parents who make them feel loved. My father wasn't one of those parents. Nothing was ever good enough. Not my grades, not my career, not my choices, not even my efforts. No matter what I accomplished, there was always something wrong with it. If I earned second place, he wanted first. If I worked hard, he pointed out what I could have done better. If I succeeded, he reminded me of my mistakes. For years, I convinced myself he was simply tough, old-fashioned, demanding. That was easier than admitting the truth. The truth was that criticism had become his way of communicating. And unfortunately, I got used to it. As an adult, I built a successful life despite the constant negativity. I married, raised children, bought a home, created stability. Yet every interaction with my father still felt like an evaluation. Like I was a teenager waiting for a report card. Then came the surgery. It wasn't life-threatening, but it was serious. A complicated abdominal procedure that required several days in the hospital and weeks of recovery afterward. The doctors were optimistic. Still, surgery is surgery. At my age, nothing feels routine. The night before the operation, I barely slept. My wife stayed by my side. My children called constantly. Friends checked in. The support meant everything. One person never called. My father. That didn't surprise me. By then, my expectations were low. The surgery itself went well. At least that's what the doctors told me. I barely remember waking up. Only fragments, bright lights, voices, machines beeping, the overwhelming exhaustion that follows anesthesia. For the first 2 days, recovery was difficult. Every movement hurt. Every cough hurt. Even sitting up felt like a major accomplishment. But gradually, things improved. The nurses were wonderful, patient, kind, professional. By the 3rd day, I could walk short distances through the hallway, not comfortably, but enough to feel hopeful. That morning, one of the nurses told me I might be discharged within a few days if progress continued. For the first time since surgery, I felt genuinely optimistic. Then my father arrived. I wasn't expecting him. Honestly, I had almost forgotten about him. When the door opened and I saw him standing there, I felt a strange mix of surprise and caution. Part of me hoped this visit would be different. Maybe age had softened him. Maybe seeing me in a hospital bed would bring out compassion. Maybe for once he would simply act like a father. I should have known better. At first, the conversation seemed normal. He asked how I was feeling. I gave a brief answer. He sat down in the visitor chair. For a few minutes, everything was civil. Then he started asking questions. Questions about the surgery. Questions about my recovery. Questions about medical decisions. Nothing unusual, until his tone changed. Suddenly every question became criticism. Why did I choose that hospital? Why did I trust those doctors? Why didn't I seek additional opinions? Why wasn't I recovering faster? I stared at him in disbelief. Recovering faster? I was 3 days removed from major surgery. The doctors were happy with my progress, yet somehow that wasn't enough. Again, just like always. I tried changing the subject. It didn't help. The criticism continued. Then came the comment that made my stomach drop. He looked around the room and shook his head. "You've always made life harder than it needs to be." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I was lying in a hospital bed recovering from surgery. And somehow he had found a way to turn it into another lecture. I felt anger rising inside me, but most sadness. Because even now, after all these years, a small part of me had hoped for something different, some sign that he cared. Instead, I got more criticism, more judgment, more disappointment. What happened next would humiliate me in a way I never expected, and set off a chain of events that neither of us saw coming. For a few moments after my father's comment, neither of us spoke. The hospital room suddenly felt much smaller. I stared out the window, trying to calm myself. I didn't want an argument. Not there. Not while I was recovering. Not while every movement still caused pain. But my father wasn't finished. He leaned back in his chair and shook his head again. You know, when I was your age, I wasn't sitting around in hospitals. I blinked. At first, I thought he was joking. He wasn't. The expression on his face told me everything. He genuinely believed this was an appropriate thing to say. I looked at him. Nobody chooses surgery, he shrugged. Maybe not, but people make choices that lead to these situations. The statement hit me like a punch, not because it was accurate, because it wasn't. My condition wasn't caused by poor decisions. It wasn't caused by carelessness. It was simply one of those medical problems that sometimes happen. The doctors had explained that repeatedly, but facts rarely mattered when my father had already decided on a narrative. For him, every problem needed someone to blame, and that someone was usually me. I tried ending the conversation politely. I appreciate you visiting. Normally, people understand what that means. My father didn't. Instead, he stood up and began pacing around the room. The more he talked, the worse things became. He criticized my career choices. He criticized how I raised my children. He criticized my retirement plans. Somehow, within 10 minutes, the conversation had shifted from surgery to a complete review of my entire life. And according to him, I had failed nearly every category. I sat there listening, not because I agreed, because I was exhausted, physically, emotionally, mentally. Eventually, the door opened. A nurse entered to check my vitals. Immediately, my father transformed. His tone softened. His posture relaxed. He smiled politely. The change was so dramatic it was almost impressive. The nurse greeted both of us and began checking monitors. Everything looked good. My blood pressure was stable. My recovery remained on track. Before leaving, she smiled. "You're doing great, Henry." 3 simple words. "You're doing great." Words my father had almost never spoken. The nurse left. The door closed, and within seconds his pleasant attitude disappeared. Just like that, as if someone had flipped a switch. "Those people always say that," he muttered. I laughed quietly. I couldn't help it. The contrast was ridiculous. "What? They tell everyone they're doing great." I shook my head. At that point, arguing felt pointless. Nothing positive could survive around him. Every compliment became meaningless. Every success became luck. Every accomplishment became inadequate. Then my phone rang. It was my daughter. I answered immediately. The conversation lasted only a few minutes. She asked how I was feeling, told me she loved me, promised to visit the next day. Simple things, normal things. The kind of conversation family members have when they care about each other. When I hung up, I noticed my father watching me. His expression wasn't warm. It wasn't proud. If anything, it looked annoyed. Then he said something that stunned me. "You've made those kids too soft." For a second, I honestly thought I had misheard him. "My daughter called to check on me." "Exactly." I stared at him. "What's wrong with that?" He crossed his arms. People today are obsessed with emotions. I couldn't believe this conversation was real. My daughter cared enough to call her recovering father, and somehow that was a problem. The absurdity would have been funny if it wasn't so frustrating. I took a slow breath, then another. Eventually I reached my limit. "Why are you here?" The question hung in the air. My father looked surprised. "What? Why are you here?" For the first time all afternoon, he didn't have an immediate answer. Because honestly, I wasn't sure he knew. He certainly wasn't there to support me. He wasn't there to encourage me. He wasn't there to help. The visit felt less like concern and more like an inspection. A search for flaws. A search for weaknesses. A search for something to criticize. The silence stretched between us. Then his expression hardened, and I knew I had touched a nerve. What happened next would become one of the most painful moments of my life. Not because of physical pain, because of what it revealed. He stepped closer to the hospital bed, closer than necessary, closer than comfortable. Then he looked directly at me. "If you spent half as much time improving yourself as you do questioning me, maybe your life would have turned out differently." The words hit harder than he realized. Not because I believed them, because after decades I was tired. Tired of proving myself, tired of defending myself, tired of hoping for approval that was never coming. For the first time in my life, I stopped arguing. I stopped explaining. I stopped trying to win. Instead, I simply looked at him and said, "I'm done." His face immediately changed. Not anger, confusion. As if he genuinely didn't understand what I meant. And maybe he didn't. Because what I was about to do would change our relationship forever. And neither of us knew it yet. "I'm done." The words hung in the air between us. For a moment, my father simply stared at me, confused, almost offended, as if he couldn't understand how the conversation had reached this point. "What does that mean?" he asked. I looked at the hospital ceiling for a second before answering. Because honestly, I was tired. Not just tired from surgery, tired from decades of the same cycle. Criticism, disappointment, judgment. No matter what happened in my life, it was never enough. No matter what I achieved, there was always another flaw to point out. And suddenly, lying in that hospital bed, I realized something important. I didn't have to keep participating. It means I'm done trying to earn your approval. The room became silent. My father crossed his arms. That's ridiculous, maybe. But it didn't feel ridiculous. It felt liberating. For the first time in my life, I wasn't arguing. I wasn't defending myself. I wasn't trying to convince him of anything. I was simply telling the truth. He opened his mouth to respond. Then the door opened. A nurse entered with medication. Immediately, my father stepped back. The nurse noticed the tension instantly. Good nurses notice everything. She smiled politely while checking my chart. Then she looked at me. "Everything okay in here?" It was a simple question. But for the first time, I didn't automatically protect him. I didn't make excuses. I didn't pretend. I simply said, "Not really." The nurse looked at me carefully, then at my father. Something in her expression changed. Professional, alert, observant. She finished her work and quietly asked if I needed anything. I nodded. "Actually, yes." My father shifted uncomfortably. I continued, "I'd like some time alone." The room became very quiet. My father looked shocked. For years I had tolerated his behavior. For years I had accepted comments I shouldn't have accepted. And now for the first time I was setting a boundary. The nurse politely turned toward him. "Sir, we'll need to give the patient some time to rest." He didn't argue, at least not with her. A few moments later he walked out of the room. The door closed behind him, and for the first time that entire day I could breathe. The nurse stayed for another minute. Before leaving, she quietly said something I'll never forget. "You don't have to accept treatment from family that you wouldn't accept from anyone else." Then she left. I thought about those words for hours, because she was right. If a stranger had spoken to me that way, I would have walked away. If a coworker had treated me that way, I would have addressed it. Yet somehow family often receives permission to behave in ways nobody else could. That evening my wife visited, then my children. When they asked how my day had gone, I finally told the truth. Not dramatically, not angrily, just honestly. The reaction surprised me. My daughter looked heartbroken, my son looked furious, my wife looked sad. Then my daughter said something that changed my perspective completely. "Dad, you've spent your whole life trying to make him happy." I didn't answer. "Because she was right," she continued. "And he spent his whole life moving the goalposts." That one sentence described decades of my relationship with my father. Nothing was ever enough because enough was never the point. The next morning, my phone rang. It was my father. I didn't answer. A voicemail appeared, then another, then a third. For once, I didn't rush to listen. I focused on recovery instead, walking, resting, healing, the things that actually mattered. A few days later, I was discharged from the hospital. Going home felt wonderful. Sleeping in my own bed, sitting in my own living room, drinking coffee from my favorite mug. Simple things suddenly felt extraordinary. Meanwhile, my father continued calling. Not constantly, but often. Eventually, I listened to the messages. None contained an apology, not one. Instead, they focused on how hurt he was, how disrespectful I had been, how unfairly he had been treated. The irony was almost unbelievable. For the first time in my life, I stopped chasing the conversation, stopped trying to fix it, stopped trying to manage his emotions. Weeks passed, then months. Something unexpected happened. Without the constant criticism, life felt lighter, peaceful. I spent more time with people who actually enjoyed my company, people who supported me, people who cared. And slowly, I began realizing how much emotional energy I had spent carrying a relationship that was never balanced. Then karma arrived. Not dramatic karma, not movie-style karma, real-life karma, the kind that arrives quietly. One afternoon, my aunt called. During the conversation, she mentioned something surprising. Several relatives had started distancing themselves from my father, not because of me, because of how he treated everyone. Apparently, I wasn't the only person who felt exhausted. Over the years, he had criticized cousins, friends, neighbors, family members. People were simply reaching their limit. For decades, he had pushed others away without realizing it. Now he was beginning to experience the consequences. Less phone calls, fewer invitations, smaller gatherings, more loneliness. It wasn't revenge. It was the natural result of behavior repeated over many years. Months later, he finally asked to meet. We sat together at a small cafe. The conversation was awkward. Neither of us knew where to begin. Then something happened I never expected. He apologized. Not perfectly, not emotionally, not dramatically, but genuinely. For the first time in my entire life, he admitted that he had been too critical. He admitted that he struggled to express care. He admitted that he often pushed people away, including me. The apology didn't erase the past. Nothing could do that, but it mattered. Because accountability matters, effort matters, change matters. Today, our relationship isn't perfect. Maybe it never will be, but it's healthier. Because I finally learned something that surgery had nothing to do with. Healing isn't only physical. Sometimes the deepest recovery happens when you stop accepting treatment that damages your peace. And sometimes karma isn't about punishment. Sometimes it's simply the moment someone finally has to face the consequences of how they've treated others. As strange as it sounds, that hospital stay gave me something far more valuable than recovery. It gave me the courage to stop chasing approval I never needed. And that changed my life forever. The end.